On March 7, 1944, at 12,000 feet over Brandenburg, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Huffmann of Jägerschwader 11 spotted the incoming bomber formation. A massive stream of 400 B-17s stretched across the horizon, resembling a swarm of locusts. Huffmann had witnessed this before. The Americans would release their bombs and then head back home. Near Hanover, their fighter escorts would break off due to low fuel, leaving the bombers vulnerable to attack. Huffmann checked his fuel gauge full tanks, 3 hours of combat time. The American P-51 Mustangs, with their peculiar bubble canopies and bright nose art, would be lucky to have 45 minutes over the target. The rules of aerial warfare were straightforward. A P-51 used 65 gallons of fuel per hour during normal flight. Their additional 150-gallon drop tanks extended their range, but combat maneuvers burned fuel much faster. By the time they reached Berlin, they'd be running on fumes. He recalled last week's briefing when Major Klaus Brecht Schneider had laughed at intelligence reports saying the Americans claimed 5-hour missions with the new fighters. 5 hours? Schneider had said, laughing and slapping the table. My grandmother could fly for 5 hours in a glider. These Mustangs are just fancy Spitfires with bigger fuel tanks. They'll turn back a dumber lake like they always do. However, things weren't going as expected. The first sign that something was different came when Feldwebel Ernst Miller, flying 2,000 feet below, saw a Klein Fender approaching from the west. The escorts weren't breaking off as usual. Hoffmann squinted through the haze and saw the unmistakable shapes of P-51s, with their distinctive laminar flow wings. But that didn't make sense. They should have turned back long ago, running low on fuel. What Hoffmann didn't know was that 3 months earlier, North American aviation had achieved an engineering breakthrough that would change aerial combat forever. In a converted furniture factory in Englewood, California, they had taken a decent fighter and turned it into something unprecedented, a fighter that could fly to Berlin and back, a fighter capable of hunting. This transformation started with an urgent telegram from the British in April 1940, asking for many fighters delivered quickly. North American aviation promised a prototype in just 120 days, a timeline that other companies couldn't match. Edgar Schmude, the company's chief designer, worked nonstop for 72 hours, pulling engineers from other projects. The drafting tables ran around the clock, and on October 26, 1940, the first prototype, the NA-73X, flew. It was a good aircraft, but not extraordinary. The Allison engine performed well at low altitudes, but struggled above 15,000 feet. The British received it and named it the Mustang Mark I, using it for reconnaissance and ground attacks. No one believed it would become anything significant. Then, in April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang Y and had a revelation. The airframe was exceptional, better than anything the British had produced. The laminar flow wing provided incredible speed and efficiency. However, the Allison engine was holding it back. Harker wrote a memo suggesting that if they paired the airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, they would have the best fighter in the world. On November 30, 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustang flew, and the transformation was astounding. Its top speed increased from 390 to 440 miles per hour. The Mustang's transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. With the Merlin engine, its maximum speed soared from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Its service ceiling also rose dramatically, from 30,000 feet to 42,000 feet. However, the most significant change came in its fuel consumption. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American military attaché in London, sent an excited cable to Washington. The new Mustang with Merlin engine shows fuel consumption of only 43 gallons per hour at 25,000 feet and 300 miles per hour. This changes everything. The math major Brett Schneider had dismissed as unrealistic was, in fact, conservative. The P-51D could carry 269 gallons of fuel internally, plus two 110-gallon drop tanks. At optimal cruise settings, it burned only 43 gallons per hour, providing a theoretical range of over 2,000 miles. Berlin was 750 miles from British bases, so the Mustang could fly there, fight for 30 minutes, and return home with fuel to spare, back over Brandenburg. Wilhelm Huffman was about to learn just how much the Mustang had changed the rules. He led his squadron in a diving attack on the bomber formation, using the same tactic that had worked for years: strike quickly and climb away before the escorts could react. But as he lined up on a straggling B-17, his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "Mustangs, they're following us down." This was a new development. American escorts had always stayed high to protect the bombers, knowing they couldn't afford to waste fuel chasing individual German fighters. But these Mustangs were different. They had the fuel to chase. Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group had been waiting for this moment. His P-51B, named Shangri-La, had enough fuel for 5.5 hours of flight. He had taken off from Debden at 0830, met up with the bombers over the Dutch coast, and still had 4 hours of fuel left. When he saw the 109s diving on the bombers, he didn't hesitate. "Horseback leader, this is Horseback 1. Bandits, 2 o'clock low, going down," he reported. In aerial combat, the mathematics of energy management were unforgiving. Every foot of altitude represented potential energy, and every mile per hour of speed was kinetic energy. In the brutal calculations of dogfighting, energy equaled life. The German pilots had perfected the art of conserving energy, making quick attacks and using altitude to escape. But now, they were up against escorts that could afford to use energy freely. Gentile pushed his throttle to war emergency power. The Merlin engine roared to 3,000 RPM, burning fuel at 150 gallons per hour. In a Spitfire or P-47, such fuel consumption would force him to glide home. But in the Mustang, he could maintain that setting for 20 minutes and still have reserves. Huffman saw the Mustangs coming but wasn't worried. He'd been attacked by escorts before. Fire a quick burst at the bomber, roll, dive to break away, and the Americans would always retreat. They had to. But as he pulled the trigger, sending a stream of 20mm cannon shells at the B-17's No. 3 engine, he realized the Mustang on his tail wasn't breaking off. It was getting closer. German pilots' debriefing reports from early 1944 reveal their confusion. Mann Friedrich Beck of JG-1 wrote, "The new American fighters exhibit puzzling behavior. They chase to very low altitudes and long distances from the bombers. Our usual tactics of drawing them away no longer work. They seem to have unlimited fuel." He was right. Colonel Hubert Zena, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, had completely overhauled escort tactics based on the Mustang's abilities. He told his pilots, "Forget staying close to the bombers. Your job is to clear the skies of German fighters. Hunt them, chase them, run them down. You have the fuel. Use it." This shift from defensive to offensive escort tactics marked a new era in air combat. That the Mustang's impact shattered the German interceptor strategy. For 3 years, the Germans had relied on the limited fuel range of Allied escorts to create opportunities. They would position themselves just outside the escort range, wait for the fighters to turn back, and then strike the unprotected bombers. The Mustang eliminated that window and sealed it shut. Major Gunter Specht, commanding JG-11, expressed his frustration in a March 1944 report to the Fighter Command. "The new American long-range fighters appear over our airfields as we are landing. They follow us down to treetop level, circle our bases, and wait for us to take off. We are being hunted in our own airspace. The numbers showed the brutal shift in the balance. In January 1944, before the Mustangs took numerical control, the 8th Air Force lost 377 bombers. By May, with Mustangs flying 60% of escort missions, the losses dropped to just 148. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's losses showed the opposite trend. In January, they lost 307 fighters. By May, that number had climbed to 432. But the true revolution wasn't just in the statistics. It was in the psychological shift in air combat. Lieutenant Heinz Koch of JG-11 captured it in his diary. The hunters have become the hunted. We take off knowing the Americans will be waiting. We can no longer choose when to fight. They are always there, like sharks circling a sinking ship. The Mustang's range enabled tactics that would have been reckless in any other aircraft. Freelancing became the new strategy. After escorting bombers to their targets, Mustang pilots would drop down to low altitudes and strafe ground targets, airfields, rail yards, and moving vehicles. They returned to base with footage of trains exploding and German aircraft burning on the ground. Technical Sergeant Charles Bailey, a crew chief with the 357th Fighter Group, remembered how the pilots' attitudes had shifted. Earlier in 1944, they returned talking about how many bombers they'd protected. By summer, however, they were competing to see who could destroy the most trains. One pilot, Captain Fletcher Adams, even returned with tree branches in his air scoop after flying that low. The Germans tried to adapt by experimenting with larger drop tanks for their fighters, but they couldn't match the Mustang's efficiency. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G consumed 70 gallons of fuel per hour at cruising speed, and the Focke-Wulf 190 burned even more. Even with drop tanks, they couldn't match the range of the P-51. In desperation, the Luftwaffe devised new tactics like company front attacks where 40 to 60 fighters would make single concentrated pass through the bomber formation. However, these attacks required time to assemble, and the roving Mustangs would break them up before they could form. The mathematics of attrition were inevitable. Every German pilot lost represented years of training that could not be replaced. In contrast, each American pilot lost was replaced by 2 more. As the training system churned out 3,000 new pilots every month, General Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter forces, saw the situation clearly. In a post-war interrogation, he said, "The Mustang was the decisive weapon, not because it was superior to our fighters in combat, though it was very good, but because it could be everywhere. We could no longer find safety anywhere. Even our training bases in Czechoslovakia were under attack." The production numbers further deepened Germany's crisis. By mid-1944, North American Aviation's Englewood plant was producing 20 Mustangs per day. The Dallas plant added another 15 Mustangs to the production line. And by December 1944, monthly production peaked at 630 units. Over the course of the war, Germany produced around 33,000 single-engine fighters of all types, while North American Aviation built 15,586 Mustangs, with production ramping up even as German factories were being destroyed. In September 1944, Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-77, wrote a desperate memorandum. "The enemy's numerical superiority is crushing, but worse is their operational freedom. Our pilots must fight over their own airfields. They must conserve fuel while the Americans burn it freely. They must calculate every maneuver while the enemy attacks with abandon. We are fighting the arithmetic of the possible against the arithmetic of abundance." The kill ratios reflected this new reality. In 1943, German fighters claimed 3 Allied aircraft for every one they lost. By late 1944, Mustangs were claiming 6 German aircraft for every loss. The top American aces were all flying Mustangs. Major George Prey scored 26 victories, Colonel John Meyer claimed 24, and Captain Doane Gentile achieved 23. These victories weren't just about defending bombers. They were hunting victories, with German fighters caught while taking off, landing, or trying to return to base. The Mustang's impact went beyond fighter combat. Operation Jackpot, launched in May 1944, specifically targeted German training bases. Mustangs flew 700-mile missions to intercept student pilots in the air. On May 29th, Mustangs from the 78th Fighter Group caught an entire training flight over Leipzig. 12 Messerschmitt 109s flown by student pilots were shot down in just 4 minutes, with the instructors powerless to intervene. Oberfeldwebel Siegfried Bethke, a flight instructor with Jagdflieger 103, survived one such encounter. He recalled, "We were practicing formation flying, just basic maneuvers. Suddenly, there were Mustangs everywhere. My students had perhaps 20 hours in fighters. The Americans had hundreds. It was not combat. It was execution." By December 1944, Germany had essentially lost daylight air superiority over its own territory. Hitler's Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16th, came with explicit orders to only attack in bad weather. The reason was simple. Clear skies meant Mustangs, and Mustangs meant annihilation. General der Jagdflieger Gordon Golub summarized the German pilots' dilemma in a staff meeting that month. "Our pilots take off knowing they are already outnumbered 5 to 1. They know the Americans have better fuel supplies, better aircraft, and better everything. But worst of all, they know the Americans can follow them home. There is no respite, no sanctuary, no moment of safety from takeoff to landing. The fuel situation had become so dire that German fighters were limited to 1 combat sortie per day, and often even that was impossible." Meanwhile, American pilots were flying double missions, taking off at dawn to escort the morning raid to Munich, returning for lunch and refueling, then escorting the afternoon raid to Frankfurt. The mathematics of war had turned into a mockery of the Germans' capabilities. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described a typical late-war mission. "We'd escort the bombers to target. Then half of us would go hunting. I'd drop down to 5,000 feet and fly east until I found something: rail lines, airfields, convoys. The crowds had to move in daylight sometimes, and when they did, we were there. I once chased a single truck for 30 miles. Why? Because I could. Because I had the fuel. The Mustang even changed the nature of air combat training." American pilots arriving in England received extensive ... American pilots received specialized training in fuel management, not to conserve fuel, but to maximize their time hunting over enemy territory. They learned to fly at specific RPM settings and manifold pressures that would allow them to stay in the air for an extra 30 minutes, far beyond what would normally be possible. In contrast, German pilots were taught to minimize their time in combat and conserve every drop of fuel for the return flight. This difference in approach had a devastating psychological impact on German pilots. Lieutenant Oscar Busch of JG-3 wrote to his wife in February 1945, "The Americans own the sky. We take off in darkness and land in darkness. Even then, they sometimes catch us with their navigation lights off, hunting by sound. Last week, Weber was shot down in the landing pattern, geared down, flaps extended. The American followed him through the entire approach and killed him 500 meters from the runway." By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was resorting to desperate tactics, including ramjigger or ramming attacks, where volunteer pilots would attempt to ram American bombers, bailing out at the last moment if possible. However, even these suicide attacks were often thwarted by Mustangs, which would shoot down the ramming fighters before they could reach their targets. The final statistics tell a staggering story. Mustangs flew 213,873 sorties over Europe, dropped 500,000 gallons of napalm, fired over 4 million rounds of ammunition, and claimed 4,950 aerial victories. They lost 2,520 aircraft to all causes, resulting in a loss ratio of 1 Mustang for every 85 sorties flown, while 2 German aircraft were destroyed for every Mustang lost. But perhaps the most telling statistic was that, by April 1945, the average experience level of a German fighter pilot was less than 50 hours in the aircraft type, while the average American Mustang pilot had over 400 hours of flight time. The mathematics of attrition had reached their inevitable conclusion. Germany had run out of experienced pilots faster than it could replace them with new aircraft. General der Flieger Wissow Schmidt, in a post-war analysis, summed up the fate of the Luftwaffe's fighter force. The Mustang didn't defeat us through superior performance, though it was a superb aircraft. It defeated us through superior presence. It was always there, in numbers we couldn't match, with endurance we couldn't equal. Flown by pilots we couldn't train fast enough to replace our losses. The mathematics of modern war had rendered our skills irrelevant. The lessons learned over the flaming cities of Germany still resonate in modern air forces. Today's air forces continue to struggle with the challenges of distance and fuel consumption. For example, despite its advanced technology, the F-22 Raptor has a combat radius of only 600 miles. In contrast, the Mustang, designed with slide rules and wind tunnels, could fight 750 miles from its base. Sometimes, the mathematics of war come down to simple endurance. Wilhelm Hoffmann, the German pilot we met over Brandenburg, survived the war. In a 1985 interview, he reflected on that pivotal March day when everything changed. We had trained for short, sharp engagements. Climb, attack, dive away, land. The Mustang pilots fought like they had all day because they did. And when I finally shot down my first Mustang in January 1945, I was so low on fuel I had to glide the last 10 kilometers to my airfield. As I climbed out of my aircraft, another Mustang strafed the field. He had followed me home, watching me land, waiting for the perfect moment. That was when I truly understood. They weren't just escorts anymore. They were hunters and we were the prey. The mathematics of air warfare had been rewritten in the skies over Europe. Distance divided by fuel consumption, multiplied by tactical aggression, equaled air supremacy. This equation was written in aluminum and gasoline, solved by young men at 25,000 feet, and paid for in blood and burning aircraft. The Mustang had indeed lived up to Ronald Harker's prediction. It had become the best fighter in the world, not due to superior dogfighting skills, though it had those, but because of something more fundamental. It redefined what a fighter could do and where it could do it. The laughter in German briefing rooms had long since faded, replaced by the grim arithmetic of survival against impossible odds. The hunters of the Luftwaffe had discovered a harsh truth. When the mathematics of war shift against you, when your enemy can go wherever you go and stay longer, courage and skill become academic exercises. The Mustang hadn't just extended fighter range. It had extended American power projection to every corner of Nazi Germany's crumbling empire. In doing so, it had laid out the equation for modern air superiority that still defines aerial warfare today. Control of the air doesn't go to the best dogfighter, but to the force that can put the most fighters in the most places for the most time. It's a simple equation with a complex solution, one that North American aviation solved with a Packard belt. British engine in an American airframe, creating a hybrid that rewrote the mathematics of the possible.